We have two Article 4 incursions being triggered here in countries that are very concerned about Vladimir Putin's next move. What will this lead to?
Well, absolutely. This is a big source of concern for all NATO countries at this point. I think that when you first saw the drones flying into Polish airspace, there were many who initially thought, well, perhaps this was a mistake. Perhaps, these drones went off course. Yeah. I think at this point, we all have to treat these drone incursions and now these fighter incursions as Putin testing NATO.
Well, there's a difference between drones and fighters, right? There were pilots in those planes. That could have turned into a conflict.
Absolutely. And certainly our NATO pilots are trained to operate in a safe and professional way and to intercept incoming fighter jets. And thankfully, that's exactly what they did. Wow. But now is the time to shift from this focus on the specific military operation and think about what is the larger political response. Because this testing that Putin is doing, he is testing to see if NATO will stand unified. Right. He is testing not just Estonia and Poland, he's testing the United States of America. And he is waiting to hear from U.S. leaders that this is unacceptable and that we will push back. When we saw the drones going into Polish airspace, we did not see even a forceful rhetorical response. Now, certainly our military, working with allied militaries, have planned for more robust defenses in Eastern Europe. They are executing that mission as we speak. But what Putin is looking for is a sign of true division politically within NATO, and he is looking to see whether the U.S. will show support.
What does that response actually look like? If you were in the White House right now, what would you say the appropriate response is?
Well, again, the first response is to be forceful in your speech. Silence does not signal that we are supporting Europe. So there needs to be an actual, verbal response. And ideally, something beyond a quick tweet, actually a statement of concern and support. Then you shift into the more tangible responses. And I already talked about how in NATO military channels, our militaries are doing exactly what they need to do. They are working together to shore up defenses in the East, and that's what needs to happen. But in Ukraine, what you see is a structure right now of European support for the Ukrainians that appears to not include the United States of America, and that is what Putin is seeing.
Should those Russian MiGs have been shot down?
Well, I certainly wouldn't make a military recommendation. I have great confidence in how.
How come it's not an Article 5? Would the nation need to be attacked by those jets to bring us to the next level?
Article 5 specifically refers to an attack, whereas this Article 4, they're assessing the situation and they're needing to consult on further measures.
Can 4 lead to 5? Can that review lead to something greater?
Well, 4 could lead to 5. The idea is that a NATO nation would invoke Article 5 if they actually felt they were under attack. Yeah. And that is not the assessment at this time. Again, I would characterize this as testing. NATO countries, and again, the United States, is being tested.
Let's talk a little bit about the thought that's been put out there that the potential way to getting to a ceasefire and end of a conflict rests in territory swaps, whether it's ceding some of the land that Russia is already taken over, or Ukraine potentially getting Russian land and holding on to it. Is that a realistic prospect, either one?
So I think it's important to reject that proposal, which is wholly a proposal that Vladimir Putin agrees with. The Russians are looking to achieve through some kind of magical silver platter offer of territory what it could not achieve through military operations on the battlefield. We have to remember that even though the Ukrainians have suffered tremendously, what we are seeing is an incredibly slow Russian advance. I mean, if Russia kept advancing at the same rate that they are doing now, it would take years for them to conquer all of Donbass. Donbass is precisely the area that Russia wants Ukraine to give up.
Yeah.
And the word swap is a complete misnomer, because this isn't an exchange. This is Ukraine being forced to give up sovereign territory.
Another annexation.
Exactly.
Give us a status update on what's happening right now with weapons being provided to Ukraine, because the president has a different approach than Joe Biden. He's allowing NATO members to essentially buy American equipment and provide it to Ukraine, so we're not incurring the cost. We know there was an initial purchase by the Netherlands, and we've seen some other action, but is this working as planned? Is Ukraine getting what it needs?
So first of all, I think it's important to not use the term allowing Europe to purchase U.S. weapons, because for decades now,
Sure.
Europeans have been purchasing U.S. equipment, U.S. weapons, and it's not a grand gesture on the part of the United States.
And I'm not trying to make a statement by using that term, but of course we were providing that weaponry until Donald Trump got into the White House.
Absolutely. So what you see right now is Europe has actually stepped up, and they are basically shouldering not just the U.S. share, the previous U.S. share of weapons, they're also continuing to shoulder a burden on their own. And so if you look at their new process, it's this prioritized Ukraine requirements list process. It's kind of a cumbersome name. That is managed out of NATO headquarters. This is a process where the Europeans and other countries around the world, for that matter, can purchase what the NATO staff and what the Ukrainians deem are their most important requirements. But this is all the stuff that the U.S. used to provide. It's, the munitions for HIMARS,
right.
These, longer range launch systems. It's, interceptors for Patriot systems, for air defense. So these items, these munitions in particular, are now being funded by the Europeans. They're helping U.S. defense industry maintain open production lines, which is extremely helpful for not just U.S. industry, but also for U.S. readiness, so that if we need to purchase the same things, the factories are up and running, and we can just go right in and be able to purchase. So this is a huge boon to the U.S., and it's certainly helpful for the Ukrainians. But you have to wonder, how long can Europe do both its share and the U.S. share? Before 2025, at the point of January 2025, the Europeans and the U.S. had provided about the same amount, over $60 billion in security assistance. So it was equivalent. If you want the equivalent volumes in order to pressure the Russians to go to the negotiating table, to agree to a ceasefire, that means that the Europeans may be actually spending double what they were. This could be very challenging for their budgets. And you also have to look at the fact that they're paying for their own defense. They've all agreed to increase their defense spending for their own defense as well. NATO now has a 5% of GDP target of spending. And so these defense expenditures are going to be really considerable for these NATO countries, and they'll have longer-term implications for European defense industry and for U.S. defense industry.
Well, Laura, it's famously known that Europe has been underfunded in its military for a very long time, which is why you're seeing the squeeze here. But they've also, the NATO contributions, even under the previous target, they've missed them significantly, I think the exception being Poland at the end of the day. So in terms of actual NATO security guarantees that can be offered to Ukraine, can Europe even do that? And how far away are we to a viable security guarantee that comes from the European continent?
So I think, first of all, it's important to not rule out that the U.S. should be a part of whatever the security, and I would say security assurances for Ukraine, as opposed to security guarantee, because I think that right now Putin is only looking at one country as the signal of whether he's going to get away with taking over Ukraine and maybe moving beyond, and that's the United States. So I wouldn't say just European. That said, what the Europeans are doing right now is really impressive in trying to stand up a mechanism that would offer support to Ukraine. It is not an Article 5 guarantee. I don't think that there are many countries in Europe or around the world that actually would consider fighting directly with Russia in response to future Russian aggression. But what the Europeans are trying to do is have an architecture that bolsters Ukraine in its ability to withstand aggression. It's really important to recognize that what they're talking about is for after a ceasefire. So we can't ignore the fact that business right now should focus on the ceasefire. You can't ever get to security assurances if you don't actually stop the fighting in the first place. And of course, this is what President Trump was focused on in the past. So the Europeans will look to a potential multinational force, again, to help bolster Ukraine in the wake of a ceasefire. And that force would be multidimensional and has a lot of aspects that still need to be worked out.